World building has not always been the literary staple that it is today. Nowadays, it is considered an essential part of most sci-fi and fantasy novels, a criteria for criticism on par with things like character or prose. People will sometimes build entire worlds with maps, histories, cultures, and languages without ever even setting a story in that world. But contemporary world building really only materialized in the last 100 or so years. And before that, the line between a fictional world and the real one wasn't always so precise. But to take a bird's eye look at it, world building is really weird. Why would we spend hours of our lives investing into a fictional world's geography, history, politics, etc., when our own real world is right there? Why has world building, in one way or another, always been a part of our storytelling tradition? And how did we get where we are today? Well, buckle up, because I think that I do have it mostly figured out. From the circles of hell to a galaxy far, far away, and many, many stories in between. This is a sort of complete history of world building. But before we kick things off, I want to tell you a little bit about the people who help keep the lights on here, this video's sponsor, boot.dev. I'm good with obscure history, but I am notably not good with technology, so the concept of coding has always been beyond me, no matter how curious I may have been about it. But thanks to this video's sponsor, boot.dev, I've been able to give it a go, and I found out that it can actually be fun. Boot.dev uses a hands-on RPG-like experience to help you learn everything that you need to know about software development. They'll help you learn back-end web development from start to finish in Python, SQL, and Go. And better yet, you get to learn by doing what you'd actually do at a job, by building real projects. They have a Discord community filled with real humans that can help you if you ever get stuck on something, and their Training Grounds feature can provide personalized challenges to let you work even more at the concepts that you're struggling with. Boot.dev makes learning coding feel just like a game, and it's simple enough for even someone as tech illiterate as I am to follow. All of their content is completely free to read and watch, but a paid membership unlocks features like hands-on coding, progress tracking, and game mechanics. So what are you waiting for? They even have a 30-day no questions asked refund policy and a free demo of the interactive experience on every course. You can check them out at the link in my description, or just go to boot.dev and use my code JessOfTheShire to get 25% off your entire first year of the annual plan. Thank you so much to boot.dev for sponsoring this video, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. We should probably start out this whole endeavor by defining what exactly world building is, but that's no simple feat. At its simplest definition, if our world, our tangible reality, is the primary world, world building involves the construction of a secondary world, an imaginary place or time that is different to the tangible reality that most people accept. Now, the problem with that definition is that, according to that logic, every fictional story takes place in a secondary world. I could tell you the most mundane possible story about how I went down to the store to buy milk. But I did not do that, and so I have created a secondary world in which I did that. By our definition, that story, and every other story that paints a world that even slightly deviates from ours, is an example of world building, of building a secondary world. But I dare say that we can all see the difference between my little milk purchasing saga and Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, for example. World building, then, must exist on a spectrum, and in his book on imaginary worlds, Mark J.P. Wolf identifies 3 criteria that can help to locate a secondary world on that world building spectrum. These points to analyze stories by are inventiveness, completeness, and consistency. Inventiveness is essentially how much is invented in this second world. How far does it diverge from what we know to be reality? A world might choose to be minimally inventive. A lot of historical fiction falls into this category. Les Miserables asks the question, what if there was a man named Jean Valjean and all this stuff happened to him? Other than that diversion from historical reality, the world of Les Miserables is pretty close to being our real world. A little bit further down the spectrum, a world may take existing real-world material and extrapolate upon it. I think that Frank Herbert's Dune is a really good example of this. It's taking place on a different planet in a distant future, but all of the politics, systems, and organizations are based off of things from our primary world. The Imperium government is very clearly based off of feudal Europe. The Bene Gesserit are inspired by various religious orders and secret organizations, and the spice is inspired by both oil and hallucinogenics. An author may choose to be inventive in terms of the world's science, physics, or biology. New plants and animal species, like James Cameron's Pandora. You could even change the shape of the planet itself, as we see in stuff like Terry Pratchett's Discworld. In some rare instances, such as 1884's Flatland, an author may invent entirely new physical dimensions for their secondary world. The degree of inventiveness that an author chooses to employ is going to depend on the needs of the particular story taking place in that world. A minimally invented world will feel familiar and require less lore dumping to catch its audience up. A maximally invented world can make the setting itself, its unique challenges, its systems, its arresting strangeness, those things can become a character in the tale. It is possible, of course, to go too far in either direction. On the minimalist side of things, you risk things being a little bit boring. And on the maximalist side of things, you might make a world that is so unfamiliar that it's alien and completely inaccessible. The spectrum of inventiveness does not dictate how good or bad the story is. Neither minimal nor maximal are the correct way of doing world building. Inventiveness is just another tool in the toolbox of the world builder. And another tool in the box is completeness. But you must keep in mind that perfect completeness is impossible. No fictional world can ever be as complete as the primary world. But the more complete you get, the more full, real, and tangible your secondary world becomes, whether it's history, politics, economics, geography, anthropology, or science. Creating and spelling out details such as this can help with the immersion of the audience into the secondary world. But, just like inventiveness, completeness has to be used to the degree that will benefit the story. For someone like J.R.R. Tolkien, completeness was an all-consuming desire when it came to creating his fantasy world, and the density of his world-building is one of the things that entrances people into his Middle-earth. Conversely, Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland presents a world that is chaotic and quite incomplete. Carroll is incredibly sparing with details on things like how the people of Wonderland eat, how their food gets to them, their economy, their geography, etc. But this chaos brought about by incompleteness contributes to the themes of the story. Just as the child Alice is set adrift in a land that she cannot comprehend, so adult readers are destabilized by the lack of completeness, pressed back into that place of childlike befuddlement alongside Alice. Now, can completeness be used to excess? Absolutely. An overly complete story risks getting bogged down in unnecessary details, the story lost in an inundation of lore. The human mind is remarkably good at filling in gaps, and if you are able to leave some gaps in a world, it's going to make a world feel more real and lived in. But an incomplete world can also detract from the story it tells, because the audience becomes confused. Alongside completeness, we have the concept of consistency. Do the details of the world line up with each other and remain compatible throughout the story or stories told in that world? A world that takes pains to be consistent feels real and holds up to careful scrutiny, and an inconsistent world can trip people up. Inconsistency can make an audience feel betrayed. Why did they spend so much time getting to know the rules of this world if the rules were just going to change? Now then again, inconsistency can also be an authorial choice. The real world around us is inconsistent. Things and people change. Our perception or understanding of these things often change. As Mark J.P. Wolf says, consistency is necessary for a world to be taken seriously, but of course, not all worlds ask to be taken seriously. Pretty much all secondary worlds involve some degree of inventiveness, completeness, and consistency, but the amount that the author chooses to utilize is up to the individual author, and what will most benefit the story that they're telling within their secondary world. But all of these criteria have been looking at world building as an activity mostly done by one person, the author. And in the earliest days of world building, it was not such an individualized activity. We can't say definitively what the very first instance of human world building was, because we've been doing it since the beginning of time. We have always sought to better understand our real world by creating fictional worlds inside it. The myths and legends that helped us to make sense of the world before we had things like science to make things clear. Thunder is loud and scary, so we invent a story that explains why it happens. Thus, we have created a secondary world, wherein thunder is not caused by electrons in clouds, but by a deity. These were, in a way, acts of communal world building, wherein we reshaped our known reality into something more digestible. These were, perhaps, incomplete and inconsistent worlds without a massive degree of inventiveness, but we didn't need them to be any more than that. Even our earliest known story, the 4,000-year-old Epic of Gilgamesh, portrays something of a secondary world. I'm sure that most ancient Mesopotamians had never actually met someone like Gilgamesh, who was 2/3 divine, or a wild man made out of clay, but they dreamed up a world in which such a thing could exist. Maybe this wasn't intentional fiction. Maybe some people telling or hearing the story really believed the words to be true, but I think that it still counts as a secondary world, and they were using that secondary world to explore very important ideas that no other story could. Concepts of friendship, divinity, immortality, and mortality. Secondary worlds continued thriving in the realm of myth, particularly in the case of afterlife beliefs. Most cultures developed some conception of a place beyond physical reality, be it Hades or Oru, where human souls may go when they died. This secondary world served a number of purposes. It was reassurance in the face of death, the assurance that something would come after, and it could act as social control. You would be motivated to do better in the hopes of ending up with a good afterlife. Second world afterlives filled in the unknown with something that could be known, giving humans the illusion of control. The spiritual unknown was not the only mystery in our ancient history. There was also the physical unknown. What happens beyond the borders of the lands that are familiar to you, past the edges of the map? Many early adventure stories have the hero traversing beyond these boundaries into strange secondary worlds appended onto our own. Homer's 7th or 8th century BC Odyssey sees Odysseus confronting monsters and magic outside the waters of the known world. Again, we cannot say with certainty that the story of the Odyssey was intentional fiction. It is possible that Homer fully believed the tales that he was telling, but we also know that he most certainly did not see these events with his own eyes, and not just because he was blind. Intentionally or not, Homer and storytellers of his kind were creating secondary worlds to fill in the fringes of the primary one. For works of early intentional secondary world building, we can look to utopias. As early as the 4th century BC, Plato wrote of the city of Atlantis, a fictional city granted near perfection by the gods. Plato used Atlantis as an allegory to explain human hubris, and although it may not have been a perfectly complete or consistent secondary world, it was certainly inventive. Many of the earliest things we can point to as intentionally crafted secondary worlds are these utopias, these allegorically invented perfect places or times through which one can examine the imperfections of the primary world. They weren't just making secondary worlds for fun, although they probably were doing that to some degree. Secondary worlds had a distinct purpose. They were able to teach things through story that no other story was able to teach. Satire was another medium rich with secondary worlds. In the 2nd century AD, Lucian of Samosata produced his True History, a satirical work meant to mock the supposedly true accounts of authors like Homer. He writes of his cosmic journey to the moon and sun, where he was entangled in a war between the factions of the moon and sun, where he saw giant ants and whales and fishmen. True History is regarded as some of the earliest science fiction, but I think it's also a great example of world building. Lucian may not have gone deep into the tax policy of the Moon King or the science behind how exactly a river of wine forms, but he was certainly creating a world beyond the bounds of our primary one. And True History is notable as being intentionally composed fiction. Through this fiction, Lucian was acknowledging the untruthfulness of travel accounts of the past, meaning that there must have been some sort of a general understanding by the 2nd century that the tales of Homer and the like were not strictly factual. Thus, this isn't just an interesting secondary world, but also proof that there was a general understanding that secondary worlds had existed and had been seen as fictional secondary worlds in the past. The secondary world tradition was also booming outside of the Western world. In 1001 Nights, a story put together sometime in the Islamic Golden Age from the 8th to the 13th century, we find explorations of underwater societies and ancient lost cities. The framing device of 1001 Nights is that a young woman, Scheherazade, is a storyteller, telling these stories that contain these secondary worlds, meaning that these ventures into other worlds are framed as fiction. But when it comes to what we contemporarily think of as world building, a secondary world that is inventive, complete, and somewhat consistent, many people point to the Divine Comedy as one of the first real examples. Composed by Italian poet Dante Alighieri in 1321, the Divine Comedy follows its narrator on his journey to hell, purgatory, and heaven. Although it is loosely based off of biblical accounts and religious doctrine, the Divine Comedy also invented quite a bit of material. The concept of the 9 circles of hell, Dante's depiction of sin and their consequent punishments, even the idea of purgatory as its own separate entity, these were all things created by Dante to augment and illustrate religious doctrine. There were allegorical explanations of divine other worlds before Dante, and there would be many after, but he was groundbreaking in his specificity and detail. Dante uses rich, vivid language to describe these spiritual realms, transforming them from lofty concepts into real, tangible secondary worlds. And throughout all of this, the utopic tradition was still going strong. From St. Augustine's City of God to Al-Farabi's Virtuous City, secondary worlds were being used to highlight the deficiencies of the primary world. In the early 16th century, Sir Thomas More's Utopia told of a traveler's journey to an island where there was no war, no poverty, no overpopulation, and no need for laws. This work explored concepts of private property, the need or lack thereof for capital punishment, and what a society might look like where everyone performs to their best of their abilities and asks for nothing more than what they need. Sir Thomas More's secondary world filled in a surprising amount of apparently unnecessary details, including things like the city's history, its culture, and the people's way of life. It was also one of the first secondary worlds to be accompanied by a map for reference. This story, and almost every secondary world story, was also framed by a frame narrative. Sir Thomas More's Utopia comes to us from a report of someone going out to that land and coming back again to share its tales. This means that many of these early secondary world stories can also be thought of as travelers' tales, which was an incredibly popular genre through most of human history. Traveling was expensive, dangerous, and completely inaccessible for the average person. So people that were able to go out and travel could make very good money from coming back home and telling people what it was that they'd seen, whether or not their accounts were strictly true. In fact, most people didn't really care at all if they were telling the truth. It's not like these people were writing travelers' how-to guides. Nearly every person hearing these accounts would never have the chance to double-check the author's work. So if they're sitting back and hearing stories about how in the next continent over there's venomous trees and people with dog heads and two-headed geese, who cares if it's true? It is entertaining, and that's what matters. Authors likewise relished in these gray lines between fact and fiction. Some authors were known to intentionally invent and augment their stories with salacious and exciting details to help their accounts sell, but then once these fictional facts are in the pool of knowledge, they're going to get propagated. Other people might accidentally share fictional things because they're copying information from another person's source, and thus they're propagating fictional information alongside the non-fictional. And while this isn't good in terms of, translating real information, because the line between fact and fiction was so blurry, travel logs could do much more than just account a journey. They could be used as a tool on an allegorical level. Just as a perfect utopia tells us about the imperfect world outside city walls, so a story about a distant land can help shape and reshape our perception of the world that we walk in every day. But time marches ever on, and as maps got better, people explored further, and the unknowns on the maps became knowns, and we had to start looking elsewhere for our places to host secondary worlds. In 1657, Cyrano de Bergerac's The Other World, Comical History of the States and Empires of the Moon, was published. This novel took advantage of our ever-increasing understanding of science and the natural world, integrating quite a bit of the real science from his day. In the story, the Earth and Moon orbit around the Sun, as we know that they do today, and the Earth spins. Of course, the protagonist, Cyrano, does manage to propel himself into the atmosphere using a jar of dewdrops, because dewdrops float away in the morning, and so he captures them in a jar and they send him into the atmosphere. So, not all of the science was entirely sound. The dewdrops don't entirely work, though. He just ends up in Canada, so he has to use fireworks to get all the way to the moon. And on the moon, there is apparently a new Garden of Eden, and a whole slew of other theological allegories. Cyrano takes a trip to the sun and meets their people, and he encounters a kingdom of birds. This story was certainly an allegorical travelogue, like many before it, but authors were becoming more and more bold in how overt and inventive they allowed their secondary worlds to be. In 1666, Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, published The Blazing World, in which a young woman is set adrift to the North Pole, where she finds passage to a parallel planet. There, she finds human-animal hybrids and establishes herself as the Empress, creating a whole new religion. The Blazing World was intended to be a satirical utopia, critiquing issues like division in the government and excess power, but it proved that utopic allegories did not need to happen on our plane of existence in order to be effective. But our world builders were not just looking up to space, they were also looking down. And in the 1700s, we saw a growing wave of stories that take place inside the supposedly hollow Earth. One such story is 1741's Neil Klim's Underground Travels, written by Ludwig Holberg. It tells of Niels Klim, a philosopher who takes a tumble down a hole in the ground and finds himself entrenched in the politics of Earth's internal civilizations. Among strange tree-like human beings with like 6 arms and sentient monkeys, the part of this whole thing that Klim finds the craziest is the political machinations of this society. Get this? They've allowed women to have a place in the government, which is obviously the root of all of their problems. Niels Klim is considered a part of the early science fiction canon, and it is an important part of world building, coming to influence and inspire many Hollow Earth stories to come. The craft of world building would really start settling into its own with the emergence and popularization of the novel. With literacy rates on the rise throughout the 19th century and printing cheaper than ever thanks to the Industrial Revolution, reading was going from being a skill to a pastime. Novels became one of the primary ways that stories were conveyed, and intentionally composed fiction and fantasy also found its footing. With the emergence of modern science, we see more and more of a clear separation between realistic literature and fantastic literature. No longer was the line between fiction and fact so blurry. People understood that the worlds that they were reading were factually unreal, and they wanted more. But outside of being a frame for a story, during this time, world building itself, as a hobby and pastime, was becoming more and more popular. In the early 19th century, it was taken up by the Bronte sisters. Best known for works like J.R.R. and Wuthering Heights, the Bronte sisters had an incredibly isolated childhood, where world building became one of their primary pastimes. Together, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne invented Glasstown, an African kingdom where each of them had their own islands to manage. They drew maps for Glasstown, developed the land's geography, and they used the sandbox that they made to tell stories. From Glasstown, they would go on to create the lands of Angria and Gondal, building out these countries and using them as the staging ground for war, romance, and any other stories they could invent. Glasstown, Angria, and Gondal were not created for the express purpose of allegory or as a necessary frame for a story. These worlds were created because it was fun. The Bronte sisters found escape from their lonely lives by inventing worlds to escape to. In 1854, we see our first story set on a planet far, far away from Earth, further than the moon or sun, with Charles Ischiers de Fontenay's Star, the marvelous history of one of the worlds of outer space. The author sets the story up by claiming to have found a metal chest that fell into the Himalayas. This extraterrestrial chest contained a collection of books documenting the far-off planet of Star. This piece was particularly unique in that it did not use the traveler as a framing device. In this story, no one goes to Star or comes back. He simply constructed an alien world and species and told us about it. Slowly but surely, the invented world was separating itself from a need or even the barest illusion of being connected to our primary world. Fantasy, and thus world building as well, would really become what it is today due to the advent of children's literature as its own genre. In the Victorian era, children began to be viewed as a separate entity rather than just being small adults, and so efforts to specifically tailor education to children began. And children's literature was a big part of this. And because children tend to have just somewhat less of an aversion to silliness or obviously unreal material, fantasy flourished in the stories that we told to children. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was published in 1865, depicting the strange world of Wonderland. Lewis Carroll, the author, was a logician by trade, and he infused Wonderland with a very literal interpretation of logic, circular arguments, paradoxical wordplay, and all. The world-building of Wonderland may not have been entirely complete, but in its own way, it was remarkably consistent and marvelously inventive. The story was a portal narrative. The fantasy world is entered into by someone from the primary world, but it stood up very well as a secondary world that did not seek to hide itself in obvious allegory or real-world parallels. There is meaning to Wonderland, of course, but it was a fantasy world, created for its own sake, and its lasting popularity proved that stories like this were worth telling. One of the most prominent figures in the realm of adult secondary world fantasy was William Morris. Morris, a Welshman, was a true jack-of-all-trades when it came to creativity. Inspired by the aesthetic of the medieval period, inflamed by the ideas of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, William Morris worked as a designer, textile artist, poet, and author. He defined the popular interior design of the Victorian era, especially through his lush wallpaper and designs, fabric, and stained glass windows. Some of his wallpaper designs are still being sold today. But it wasn't until the end of William Morris's life that he turned his eye towards writing fantasy. But when he did, the results were explosive. His 1890 novel, News from Nowhere, was a utopian science fiction tale exploring the concepts of socialism. A year later, he came out with The Story of the Glittering Plain, another tale of a socialist utopia, this one more in the vein of fantasy than science fiction. His 1894 novel, The Wood Beyond the World, is often referred to as the first imaginary world fantasy novel. It follows a young man's journey by boat to the wood beyond the world, an enchanted land inspired by medieval romances. This was followed up by The Well at the World's End, another fantasy taking place in a beautifully shaped secondary world. Morris's primary innovation was his creation of secondary worlds disconnected entirely from ours. No longer was it necessary to try and come up with a frame narrative. People didn't need to be assured that this universe was somehow connected to our real one. Whether William Morris was truly the first to have ever done this is kind of up for debate, but he certainly made strides in popularizing the form. Around this time, George MacDonald was also laying the groundwork for contemporary fantasy. He's best known for fairy tales like Phantastes, which follows a young man on his journey through a dreamlike fantasy world, and The Golden Key, where a boy is brought to fairyland. Although categorized as fairy tales, a genre typically reserved for children, MacDonald explained that it was not his intent to write children's literature. He said, "For my part, I do not write for children, but for the childlike, whether of 5 or 50 or 75. This term, childlike nature, seems to be used to describe a willingness to suspend belief, or at the very least to be open to the concept of exploring other worlds. MacDonald examines the adult fairy tale in length in his 1893 essay, The Fantastic Imagination. This essay acts as MacDonald's study into what it is that makes a fantasy story work, and why stories of that nature are worth telling. He explains that those who seek the escape of fantasy do not look to escape the laws of nature. Rather, the author of good secondary world fiction understands the laws of nature so well that they choose to change them. MacDonald writes, "To be able to live a moment in an imagined world, we must see the laws of its existence obeyed. Those broken, we fall out of it. The imagination in us, whose exercise is essential, should the most temporary submission to the imagination of another, immediately, with the disappearance of law, ceases to act. Law is the soil in which alone beauty will grow. Beauty is the only stuff in which truth can be clothed. And you may, if you will, call imagination the tailor that cuts her garments to fit her, and fancy his journeyman that puts the pieces of them together, or perhaps at most embroiders their buttonholes. Obeying law, the maker works like his creator. Not obeying law, he is such a fool as heaps a pile of stones and calls it a church." They say that the best way to learn something is by teaching it to someone else. And I think that a similar principle applies to world building when it comes to an appreciation of reality. The creation of a secondary world comes from loving and knowing or wanting to know the primary world so well that that passion spills over into a new one. You learn about something by recreating it yourself. If George MacDonald is anything to go by the end of the Victorian era, people weren't just creating imaginary worlds, but thinking about what it meant to create imaginary worlds. Now, up until this point, all the worlds that I've been talking about have been in the realm of literature, but with the innovations of the 20th century, new mediums were coming that would expand the capacity of invented worlds far beyond the written word. In the year 1900, L. Frank Baum published The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, one of the very first transmedial pieces of world building. Baum would go on to publish 13 more books in this series, all connected not by a character, but by the world that these characters lived in. This world was incredibly vibrant, brought to life not just through the text, but through the illustrations that accompanied the text. Because this art was done alongside the text and at the same time as the text, these illustrations weren't just accessories or decoration, they were key to establishing the visual language of Oz. Immediately following the success of the first Oz book, Baum would repurpose the tale for theater, creating a musical version of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz in 1901 that would see massive success. By 1904, Baum was putting out short stories with comic strip illustrations, ever expanding the world of Oz in his audience's eyes. And Baum was not the only one pushing Oz's boundaries. His first illustrator published his own Oz-inspired stories, and a spin-off book about the Woggle-Bug was published that was accompanied by merchandise like buttons, postcards, and even an unauthorized card game. Oz stories were being adapted into radio, film, and live shows. This world had far exceeded the boundaries of being a popular children's novel. By crossing the lines of novel into other mediums, Baum was able to create a true pop culture phenomena. And you have to keep in mind that it wasn't just a story that had become popular, or even a particular character or the work of a particular author. It was the collectively created world of Oz that was at the heart of this craze. Even after Baum's death, Oz would leave an indelible mark on pop culture, continuing for some time to be at the cutting edge of transmedial entertainment. Film opened up an entirely new avenue for secondary worlds to thrive in. One of its pioneers was Georges Méliès, called the father of special effects. He got into film on the ground floor, watching some of the earliest movies ever made by the Lumiere brothers in 1895. Méliès is credited with inventing camera tricks like stop motion, dissolves, and superimpositions, which means that we do have him to thank for this scene in The Lord of the Rings. He used his special effects to transport people to another world, not just through words, but through visuals. Thanks to film, an entirely new level of immersion was possible. In the 1920s and 30s, we see the emergence of pulp magazines, which were huge in terms of accelerating the popularity and growth of fantasy and sci-fi literature, but did not allow for super significant strides in terms of the craft of world building. Because most pulps published short stories or serialized stories, there wasn't a lot of room for extensive world building. Still, this would be where many authors, such as Robert Howard, Isaac Asimov, and Ray Bradbury, would get their start, becoming skilled world builders down the road once they had a little more page space to work with. But when it comes to 20th century world building, one figure looms impossibly large: J.R.R. Tolkien. Born at the end of the Victorian period, Tolkien grew up on ancient myths and Victorian fairy tales, particularly those of George MacDonald and William Morris, but his primary love was always languages. As a child, Tolkien suffered a great deal of loss and displacement, but he always came back to inventing languages, as both a pastime and a comfort. At first, he just did this among his friends and his brother, but as he grew older and his understanding of philology deepened, so did the complexity of his invented languages. But as Tolkien picked apart the process of how and why a language forms, he realized that these things don't just happen in a vacuum. A language is influenced by everything, by the geography of those who speak it, their history, their interactions with other languages, the passage of time itself. If he wanted to create a truly real fictional language, he realized that he would need a fictional world for that language to belong to. So it was that following his horrific experiences in the First World War, Tolkien began creating the bones of the most influential invented world of all time, Arda. This world began as being framed as a travel log involving an Anglo-Saxon mariner from our world drifting into the land of Fae, but it eventually became its own entirely separate secondary world. Tolkien filled out this world with people, gods, and epic stories like the Fall of Gondolin and Beren and Luthien. But for the longest time, he couldn't figure out how to publish any of this. In 1937, he published The Hobbit, a children's adventure novel that took place in entirely its own world. It was only after the success of The Hobbit, when pushed to continue the story by publishers, that Tolkien realized he might be able to make The Hobbit happen within the invented world that he'd spent the last, 20 years working on. So it was that, roughly 20 years after the publication of The Hobbit, he published The Lord of the Rings. Although it was most certainly a novel by its own right, The Lord of the Rings is dripping with Tolkien's rich and complex world building. The conflict of the story is rooted in a centuries-old battle. Characters sing snippets of ancient songs from ancient legendary cycles. They speak fully developed fictional languages. Tolkien even managed to put in a series of appendices at the end of the third book, with everything from timelines to anthropological explanations to fill in any blanks. The world that Tolkien created was not just impressively inventive, complete, and highly consistent. It was also enjoyable. The secondary world was not just a necessary vessel for this tale. It shaped the tale. It made it what it was. World building had often been thought of as a kind of chore, a necessary hassle that you had to get through in order to create a story, but Tolkien found a joy and a beauty in the craft of world building that changed the game of fiction entirely. In his 1939 essay on fairy stories, Tolkien takes the essay framework set out by George MacDonald in his work, and he goes even further. To Tolkien, fantasy, or fairy stories, were not defined by the type of story told, or even the characters or the presence of literal fairies themselves, but by the place in which these stories unfold. He calls this realm fairy. Fairy contains many things besides elves and fae, and besides dwarves, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it. Tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. Tolkien sees true fantasy as a kind of ephemeral thing, an indefinable thing. It's something that you can't specify in words, but you know it when you see it. Fairy is in the act of creation, and to Tolkien, this act was grounded in God. Tolkien was a devout Roman Catholic, and he saw our instinct to craft secondary worlds as a reflection of God's creative impulses. After all, if God created the world, and man was made in his image, would man not also have a desire to create worlds? Tolkien proclaimed, "We make still by the law in which we are made." He coined the term sub-creator to define creators of secondary worlds, and deemed this act not just pleasant, but important. Through fantasy worlds, man might be able to shake off the dust of ideas long forgotten. They may, as George MacDonald proposed, be able to sharpen their reason ever more and their understanding of the world through this very specific kind of practice. And they might find an escape from the suffering of the everyday world. Tolkien writes, I have claimed that escape is one of the main functions of fairy stories, and since I do not disapprove of them, it is plain that I do not accept the tone of scorn or pity with which escape is now so often used. In what the misusers are fond of calling real life, escape is evidently, as a rule, very practical, and may even be heroic. Why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if, when he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls? The world outside has not become less real because the prisoner cannot see it. In using escape in this way, the critics have chosen the wrong word, and what is more, they are confusing, not always by sincere error, the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. Tolkien viewed world-building not just as a hobby, but as a calling, and the love that he pours into his fictional world shows. Tolkien would continue to tinker with his invented world until his death in 1973. In fact, when he passed, he still deemed his life's work incomplete, and it was his son Christopher who would compile his work into the Silmarillion for posthumous publication. Although The Lord of the Rings wasn't an instant hit upon its publication in the 50s, by the 60s it had gained a pretty large cult following that would only grow through the 70s. And the thing is that people didn't just like the story or its message or its characters, people loved the world. Tolkien had created a secondary world that was truly immersive because of its inventiveness, completeness, and consistency. Inspired by the medieval world of our imagination, it painted a portrait of a time and place achingly familiar and yet inaccessible to many of us. Tolkien didn't just write a compelling novel, he allowed the texture of his invented world to shape his novel, and then had actually developed the material to feed those who wanted to gorge themselves evermore on his fantastical world. By the 1970s, The Lord of the Rings was a bona fide pop culture phenomena, already beginning to expand into other forms of media. Although Tolkien didn't really invent fantasy, or world building for that matter, he did awaken a voracious desire for it in many people. There was one other mammoth in the late 20th century that proved the profitability and lasting power of world building, and that is George Lucas's Star Wars. Star Wars presented audiences with a brilliantly engaging secondary world that felt real. The universe of Star Wars was dazzling and alien, but it also contained a lot of dirt and grit, just enough of that popular style of realism that it felt grounded and accessible. The world building certainly wasn't as thorough as, say, Tolkien, but it didn't need to be. People liked the way that this world was able to expand. Placing this world rather nebulously a long time ago and in a galaxy far away meant that at the very least for a while, you could do pretty much whatever you wanted to do in the Star Wars universe without risking catastrophic inconsistencies. Star Wars was also very unique for its originality. A lot of the film and TV secondary worlds we saw up until this point were adaptations of existing novels. But Star Wars found success in creating an imaginary world specifically designed for the screen. When you're telling a story with film, you are using almost an entirely different language than you would use for a novel. A detailed appendix, which served The Lord of the Rings so well, would not have worked with Star Wars. A different medium required different tools to find success, and Star Wars certainly found widespread acclaim, paving the way for many original secondary world fantasy and sci-fi films to come. In the 60s, we also saw the dawn of video games, which provided an entirely new world for world-building media. Video games also had the unique privilege of being interactive. No longer were you sitting back and hearing the traveler's tale when he's already returned from the distant land. Video games allowed you to become a part of those worlds. Although a lot of early story-based games would be adaptations of other works, it wouldn't be long before original video games with original worlds were springing forth. Computers in general were hugely impactful to the development of world building. Previously, with everything done by hand on paper, it was pretty difficult to keep everything organized. A computer can act as a kind of second brain when it comes to storing information, and although plenty of people still go at world building analog style, I don't think that anyone would argue that things like, memory cards and the ability to search a database, no one would say that those have not been instrumental to the accessibility and popularity of world building today. World building really hones into a craft of its own when it comes to tabletop role-playing games such as Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons is kind of essentially just world building until the players step onto the scene. Although a lot of our earliest tabletop role-playing games were clearly based off of works like The Lord of the Rings, they would end up doing a lot of world building of their own. As we get closer to the modern day, we also come upon the idea of the franchise. A franchise is generally thought of as a transmedial venture focusing on one aspect of a story. Now, the problem is that if you base a franchise off of a character and that character dies, you're out of luck. If you base it off of the works of one author and that author dies, you're kind of out of luck. But if you base a franchise off of a whole world, say that of the Star Wars universe or Marvel Comics, you have got yourself a ticket to success, or at least a lot of money and some frustrated fans. With a transmedial franchise based on a world, you could use different mediums, different authors, a whole different cast of characters, even entirely different planets to tell your stories. Whether you like them or not, and I know many of us do not necessarily like them, franchises are one of the best indicators of how much contemporary society is willing to lend a lot of importance and latch themselves onto a world by itself. In the present day, world building has developed into a craft of its own. There are entire subreddits, forums, apps, and websites dedicated just to the act of creating worlds. Tim Hickson from Hello Future Me has published some great books on how to do world building well, and there are a bunch of classes and workshops teaching people how to shape a secondary world. I would say that most people world build with the intent to eventually tell a story in that world, but there are plenty of people who are just in it for the love of the game. They just like doing it. At the very least, world building has definitely become a prerequisite for most sci-fi and fantasy stories. It is a criteria upon which the quality of a story is judged. Good world building is praised, and bad world building is critiqued, just like prose or characters or plot would be. Now this brings us all to, why do we like to world build? And not to go all Darwin on ya, but it must be doing something for us, or else we wouldn't be doing it. I believe that there is something that the creation of secondary worlds does to our brain. It acts as an outlet, an escape. It can create a new lens with which to view our own world. Of course, the benefits of storytelling on the whole have been expounded upon endlessly, including by myself, but I think that there is something particularly important in the worlds wherein these stories occur. World building is more than just homework, it's more than just a necessary evil, more than just a way to help your story get into people's hands. It is, in a way, a pursuit of freedom. Take, for example, Henry Darger. Henry Darger was a social outcast with a truly difficult upbringing and a lot of other mental health issues throughout his life. But just before his death in 1973, it was discovered that he had spent the last 50 years of his life working tirelessly on a secondary world. He had written a 15,000-page single-space novel, producing more than 300 illustrations to accompany it and flesh out his world. Darger was a recluse. He did not make this world or fill it in such staggering detail to share it with others. We don't really know why exactly he did it, but I suspect it's because he felt that he needed somewhere else to go. From Tolkien to the Brontes to the many incredible world builders that history has forgotten, we have been building worlds inside our own world because they help, they comfort, distract, and encourage us, whether we are making them or taking them in. Tolkien believed that The peculiar quality of joy in successful fantasy can thus be explained as a sudden glimpse of the underlying reality or truth. It is not only a consolation for the sorrow of this world, but a satisfaction, and an answer to that question, is it true? The answer to this question that I gave at first was, quite rightly, if you have built your little world well, yes, it is true in that world. That is enough for the artist. It's really hard to institute actual change in the world, and maybe it's impossible, but I know for sure that we can invent worlds in which change is possible. If you take one thing away from this video, whether you are a consumer or creator of secondary worlds, let it be that everything's already been done. And no, I don't mean that to discourage you or scare you, but to set you free. You have the privilege of creating and consuming in a long and storied line of people who have been doing the exact same thing. It is next to impossible to create anything original, but that means that you're creating something that belongs to this centuries-long tradition. So go for it. Write what you want to write. There are more worlds out there to explore than you could possibly dream of. Let me know in the comments who your favorite world builder is, and no, you cannot say Tolkien. That's cheating. You're on this channel. We all know you like Tolkien. I do too. So go ahead and give me someone else. I really love Terry Pratchett's world building. Obviously, it has a little bit of that kind of Wonderland anti-logic in it sometimes, which I really like, but let me know who your favorite is. Go ahead and give this video a like and share it with a friend because that really helps me out. And do consider subscribing if you want to tune in every other week to hear me talk about fantasy, the art of storytelling, and the other stuff that I like to talk about sometimes. Okay, there's a spider that keeps jumping on me as I'm trying to film this video, and if it jumps on me one more time, I'm gonna scream until my head pops, so I guess I better wrap this thing up. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.